I've learned that most people move through life believing their story is mostly settled by the time they reach their 50s. You know your family, you know where you come from, you know who raised you and who shaped you. Your memories form a kind of foundation, and even if that foundation has cracks in it, at least it's familiar, at least it's yours. But all of that can shift in a moment, sometimes because of something as small as a piece of paper. My name is Sarah Bennett. I'm 55 years old, and until last year, I believed I was an only child. My mother never mentioned siblings. My childhood photo albums showed just me, and every story she told about my birth was simple, gentle, and wrapped in that soft nostalgia mothers use when they talk about the day their child came into the world. But memories don't always tell the truth. Sometimes they protect it, sometimes they bury it. And sometimes the truth waits quietly for decades until someone opens the wrong envelope at the wrong time, or maybe at exactly the right time. It started on a quiet winter afternoon here in Colorado, the kind where the air has that sharp, brittle edge and the snow outside looks almost too still, like a photograph someone forgot to unfreeze. My mother had passed away 3 months earlier, and I had finally gathered the courage to go through the last of her things in the attic. Not the obvious boxes full of recipes and Christmas ornaments, not the old books or the sweaters she could never bring herself to throw out. I was working through the things she kept tucked out of sight, the things she never told anyone she kept. There was one box in particular, a simple gray filing box with a metal latch, no label, no markings, the kind of box people use for tax returns or utility bills. Something completely unremarkable, which somehow made it feel ominous. I opened it expecting nothing. Instead, I found the truth about my entire existence. Inside the box were old hospital papers, vaccination records, and a few brittle receipts from the late 1960s. I flipped through them slowly, scanning for anything worth keeping. Most of it wasn't. But as I neared the bottom, I found a folded birth certificate. Older than the rest, the edges soft, the ink slightly faded. I unfolded it. And that was the first moment my life divided itself into before and after. Because the birth certificate did not have one name on it, it had two babies, born minutes apart, same mother, same delivery room, same date, two tiny check boxes marked female. I stared at the paper for a long time. My vision blurred at the edges. My entire body felt too still, like the world had paused around me. My mother had only ever told me one version of my birth, one baby, one story, and yet here it was, printed in careful black ink, twin A, twin B, two daughters, both alive at birth. But the second name, the one beside twin B, was crossed out in pen, only once. A single dark stroke that did not hide it, only obscured it. Beneath the line, I could still read the name. A simple, delicate name I had never heard before in my life. It felt like looking at a ghost. I didn't move for a long time. I didn't call anyone. I didn't cry. I just sat there in the attic while the sun shifted across the insulation and dust floated in the cold light. My mother had kept this paper. She hadn't thrown it away. She hadn't destroyed it. She had just hidden it somewhere she believed I would never look. And maybe she hoped I wouldn't, but the truth rarely stays hidden forever. I read the certificate again, twice, 3 times, the official state seal, the attending physician's signature, the hospital name. Everything matched what I already knew, except for the one thing that changed everything: a twin sister, a second baby, a girl who was never part of my life. My mother had died believing I would never find this paper, or maybe she died wanting me to. I still don't know which. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the birth certificate laid out in front of me like a map to a place I didn't know existed. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the other baby died shortly after birth. Maybe it was a paperwork error. Maybe the name had been crossed out because someone realized there was a mistake. But if the twin had died, where was the death certificate? Why hide the birth certificate at all? Why erase a name instead of explaining it? By sunrise, the shock had settled into something harder, a sense of obligation, a sense of responsibility to a life I hadn't known existed. So I drove to the hospital where I was born. It had been renovated since the 1960s, but the bones of the old building were still there, under the new paint, under the polished floors, under the modern waiting area with its soft chairs and muted television. I walked in with the birth certificate in a folder and a heaviness I still can't fully explain. At the records desk, I approached a young woman who looked too new to have dealt with anything like what I was about to ask. I told her I was seeking archived birth information. I handed over the paperwork. She typed quietly for a while before telling me she would need to escalate the request. I waited in a small corner of the lobby, watching people walk in and out with flowers, balloons, and exhausted smiles. New parents, new babies, new stories just beginning. It was strange sitting there with the knowledge that my own story had started with a split, two lives born together, one erased. Eventually, an older administrator came out. She asked for permission to take the folder briefly. She disappeared again. When she returned, she asked me to sit with her in a private office. That was when I knew this was not going to be simple. The administrator was polite, gentle. She had that tone professionals use when they are trying to soften news without revealing too much. She told me that records from the year I was born were incomplete. She said there had been fires, water damage, and system migration errors over the decades. She said incomplete 3 times. But underneath all of that politeness, I sensed something else, a discomfort, a hesitation. She told me that according to what remained in the archives, a second infant had been listed as non-viable shortly after delivery. No further documentation, no death certificate, no autopsy record, nothing else. A line in a ledger, a scribble on a page, a single cold word for a life. Non-viable. But the birth certificate said she was alive at birth. The administrator could not explain the discrepancy. She only repeated that many of the hospital's records from that era were incomplete. I left with more questions than answers. That night, I returned to my mother's house. The attic still smelled like dust and cardboard, but the box where I had found the birth certificate suddenly felt different, heavier, more like an entrance to a story I hadn't chosen, but now had to finish. I dug deeper. Under the birth certificate were envelopes. Old ones, dozens of them, some sealed, some opened and resealed, some with addresses crossed out, some blank. Letters my mother had written but never sent. She hadn't written the name of the recipient on most of them, but the dates told me everything I needed to know. Many were written in the weeks after my birth, others during my childhood, one from when I was 13, another when I was 30. She had carried this secret her entire life. I couldn't bring myself to read them all at once. I opened only the one on top, dated 2 weeks after the day I was born. Inside was a letter written in my mother's familiar, slanted handwriting. A letter filled with grief, apology, and a kind of fear that seemed to seep through the ink even after 55 years. She wrote about the second baby. She wrote about being told she didn't survive. She wrote that she never saw the body. She wrote that she never heard a cry. She wrote that my father's parents pressured them to accept the explanation and move on. She wrote about crying herself to sleep for weeks. She wrote about hearing phantom sounds, 2 babies crying instead of one. She wrote that she wanted to believe the hospital, but she didn't. For the next 15 minutes, I sat on the attic floor surrounded by my mother's unsent letters and the truth she had been unable to face. The hospital said my twin had died. My mother never believed it, and for 55 years, she lived with a grief she never let herself explore. I thought about her alone in this house, alone with that knowledge, alone with that question. I thought about myself, living a life with only half the story, and I thought about the name beneath that single dark stroke of ink. I took the letters home. I took the birth certificate too, and for the next week, everything in my life rearranged itself around a single truth. I might have a sister, a twin sister, alive, somewhere. I did not tell friends. I did not tell anyone at work. This felt too fragile, too sacred, too uncertain to speak aloud. Instead, I made lists. Hospitals, clerks, nurses, county offices, anyone who might have touched paperwork in the late 1960s. Because if my mother never accepted the hospital's explanation, I couldn't either. The first real break in the search came from somewhere I never expected, a retired nurses directory, an online forum for medical workers from the 1950s, 1970s, a place where they shared stories, job photos, and long threads about the old days. I posted a quiet message, looking for anyone who worked maternity at St. Andrew's Hospital in Colorado around 1967. I expected silence. Instead, I received 3 responses within 2 days. 2 from women who remembered the hospital fondly but didn't recall anything unusual, and 1 from someone who said she had been a clerk there, not a nurse, but the person who handled birth ledgers, ID bands, and paperwork. She said she remembered families being pressured by in-laws. She said she remembered religion dictating decisions. And she said she remembered twins, not mine, not by name, but she remembered something else. She remembered a situation where a poor young couple had been convinced that raising 2 babies would be impossible. She remembered a doctor whose personal beliefs overrode his professionalism. She remembered that non-viable sometimes meant something else entirely. She remembered money being slipped quietly between hands. She remembered a baby being transferred to a different floor. She remembered a grandmother insisting that God did not give what families could not handle. She did not say the word adoption. She did not say taken. She didn't need to. It hung in the space between her words like a shadow I suddenly recognized. My twin sister had not died. She had been taken, taken from my mother, taken from me, given to someone else. And for the first time in my life, I felt the space beside me, the quiet, invisible space I had never noticed, as if someone had been missing from it all along. The first thing I did after speaking with the retired clerk was open my bathroom mirror and really look at myself. It sounds dramatic, but it was instinct. I stood there under the bright, unforgiving light and examined my own face as if it belonged to someone else. I looked at my eyes, at the shape of my nose, at the faint lines near my mouth, at the way my hair fell. For 55 years, this face had been mine alone. Now I had to consider the possibility that it existed twice. I imagined another woman somewhere in Colorado, my age, moving through her days, looking into her own mirror, seeing a reflection that might look almost exactly like mine. The thought was strange and thrilling and devastating all at once. I didn't know where she was. I didn't know who had raised her. I didn't know if she was alive or if life had been kind to her. But I knew one thing. Finding her meant stepping into a story that did not belong only to me. It belonged to her, too, and to my mother, and to the people who had made the decision to separate us. I spent the next few days reading through my mother's unsent letters one by one. Her grief traced a lonely path through decades of her life. Some letters were written to God, some to the baby the hospital told her had died, some to a future version of herself who might one day forgive the past. In all of them, there was a repeating confession. She felt something was wrong. She never saw a body. She never signed any paperwork. She never held a death certificate in her hands. She wrote that every time she asked questions, she was told she was too emotional to remember things clearly, that her grief was confusing her, that the baby she thought she heard cry was only an echo in her head. Over and over, her own reality was pushed away from her. Over and over, she was told to move on. Years later, she wrote that she had developed a strange habit. Whenever she saw twin girls in public, she would watch them for too long. She would study the way they moved, how they shared space, how they existed together in a world that had denied her that sight. She wrote that sometimes she imagined me walking with someone who looked exactly like me, an invisible ghost, always one arm's length away. Reading those letters felt like watching my mother live a second life I had never known about. One where she carried a quiet absence beside her every day. I decided I could not let that absence keep its shape. The next step was obvious. I ordered a DNA test. The small white box arrived in the mail a week later. It looked ordinary, like something you would ignore in a pile of catalogs and bills, but as I held it, it felt heavier than it should have. Inside there was a tube, a barcode, and a set of instructions written in the neutral, friendly tone companies use when they have no idea what kind of emotional landmines their product might uncover. I followed the instructions, I sealed the tube, I registered the barcode, and then I mailed away the part of myself that might know the truth. Waiting for the results was a strange kind of limbo. Life went on as usual in the visible sense, but underneath, everything felt unsettled. I went to work, I answered emails, I cooked dinner, I fed the dog, but my mind kept drifting. What if there was no match? What if she had died before I could find her? What if she never took a test? What if she had stayed hidden in the cracks of the system forever? I tried to remind myself that even without a match, the discovery mattered. My mother's suspicion had been real. The records had been altered. The retired clerk's memory had been sharp. Something had happened in that hospital. But I also knew that if there was another woman out there whose DNA was woven from the same strands as mine, the odds were increasing every year that she might decide to test too. People my age were curious. They were searching for roots, for health answers, for stories. I wasn't the only one asking questions. 3 weeks later, I received an email. Your DNA results are ready. I sat at my computer for 5 full minutes without clicking. My heart beat too fast. My hands felt cold. Then I opened the link. The first part was what everyone sees: ethnicity estimates, migration patterns, little colored map sections that try to tell you where your ancestors came from. I barely glanced at those. I scrolled straight to matches. At the top was a familiar name, a cousin I already knew about. A few more distant relatives appeared below, and then I saw it. A new name. Female. Estimated relationship. Close family. Shared DNA. Nearly 50%. There was only one relationship that could explain that much shared DNA: a sibling or a child. I had never been pregnant in my life. I clicked on the profile. The testing company had estimated the relationship as either full sibling or identical twin. A notice explained that exact categorization could sometimes be blurred depending on recombination, but the amount of shared DNA, almost complete, made it extremely likely that this person was my twin. Her name was Erin. She lived less than 60 miles away. My eyes blurred, my hands shook. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. 55 years of being an only child had ended with a single line of text on a website. There she was, not an idea, not just a name on a certificate, a living person with a real address and a world of experiences I had missed. The testing site showed a small, optional photo. She had uploaded one. It was low resolution, slightly grainy, not well lit, but it was my face, not exactly, not a perfect mirror, but close enough that my stomach flipped. The same eyes, the same line of the jaw, the same stubborn tilt to the mouth. I sat in front of my computer and stared at her image, feeling like I was seeing a part of myself that had been hidden on the far side of a wall my whole life. There was an option to send a message, a simple button: Contact Erin. I hovered over it for a long time. What do you say to the missing half of your own story? In the end, I kept it simple. I wrote that my name was Sarah, that I was born in Colorado in 1967, that my mother had recently passed away, and among her papers, I had found evidence that I was one of a set of twins. I wrote that the DNA test suggested we were closely related. I wrote that I wanted to share anything I knew about my side of the story, and then I pressed send. After that, everything became waiting again. She wrote back 2 days later. Her message was measured and cautious, but there was something gentle in it. She said that she had grown up knowing she was adopted, but the story she had been told was vague. Her adopted parents had always said her biological mother was unmarried, very young, and unable to keep her. There had been mention of a difficult birth, some suggestion of complicated family dynamics. She told me she had always wondered whether she had siblings. She had taken the DNA test on a whim because a friend had done it. When my name appeared at the top of her match list, she had stared at it for hours. She said she had noticed our shared face long before my message arrived. Her parents had passed away several years earlier, so she did not have to worry about upsetting them by looking deeper. That fact felt both lucky and sad. She told me she lived 58 miles away in a small town I knew well. I had driven past the exit sign for it hundreds of times on my way to other places. She had been that close to me for most of her life. An hour's drive, a stretch of highway I thought I knew. But until now, we had never crossed the same space at the same time. We exchanged a series of long messages over the next week. We shared basic facts, ages, careers, small details. We compared medical histories the way people our age learn to do. Age at first gray hair, first reading glasses, first joint stiffness. Our similarities felt eerie sometimes. We both loved coffee, but not tea. We both disliked loud parties. We both had the same irrational fear of driving on narrow mountain roads. We both had a faint, identical scar near the left knee from childhood falls we barely remembered. She sent me a clearer photo. This time, there was no denying it. The same eyes, the same eyebrows, the same smile that crinkled at one corner more than the other. I pulled an old photo of myself from a box in my closet, one taken in my 20s. I held both photos side by side. Two young women in different rooms, same face, same hair texture, same expression. One had grown up as the only child of a woman who believed she had lost a baby, the other as the adopted daughter of a couple who had been told they were giving a child a better life. The truth lay somewhere in the space between those stories. We both agreed that if we were going to meet, it should be in person, not as some awkward halfway step over video. We picked a halfway place, a small diner off the highway that served decent coffee and forgettable pancakes, a place that felt neutral, a place that belonged to neither of us and both of us at once. On the day of the meeting, I arrived 15 minutes early and sat in my car in the parking lot. My heart felt too big for my chest. I watched people go in and out of the diner, wondering which one might be her. I kept imagining that she would somehow look different in motion, that maybe still photos exaggerated our resemblance, and in real life we would just look like distant cousins. I told myself that would be easier. It wasn't true. When she stepped out of her car, I knew instantly. She walked like I did, same slight forward lean, same careful way of placing each step, as if always a little aware of unseen ice. She wore her hair shorter than mine, with a small silver streak near one temple. I had the same streak, just on the opposite side. It made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. Watching her cross the parking lot felt like watching a version of myself I'd never met but somehow recognized. What struck me most was not our sameness, though. It was our differences. She carried herself with a steadiness I envied. Her shoulders were a little straighter, her expression a little more open. There was something in her eyes, something like curiosity without fear. It made me wonder what parts of that came from genetics and what came from the life she had lived without me. I will not describe what we said to each other, not because it wasn't important, but because some moments feel too private to translate. What I can say is that sitting across from my twin sister for the first time at a sticky diner table felt like sliding two halves of a photo together that had been torn apart for 55 years. We studied each other openly, the same hands, the same laugh, even the way we stirred sugar into our coffee matched. We both admitted that we had spent our lives wondering, in quiet moments, whether we were missing someone we had never met. She said she used to stand in the mirror as a child and imagine another girl somewhere doing the same thing at the same time. I told her my mother had watched twin girls in grocery stores with eyes that always seemed on the verge of tears. Later, she said something that stayed with me. She said that even though her adoptive parents had loved her deeply, there had always been a faint tremor under everything, like a chord slightly out of tune. She had never been able to explain it. Now she thought maybe that sound was the echo of a life interrupted before she could remember it. We talked for hours. We shared as much as we could about who we had become. Our lives had not mirrored each other completely. We had made different choices, lived in different cities, loved different people, lost different things. But underneath all of that, there was a structure that felt the same. At some point, we both grew quiet. There was a question floating between us neither of us wanted to ask, but we both knew we had to. Why had this happened? Why had one baby been kept and the other taken? Why had our mother been told one of us was dead? Who had decided which one of us stayed and which one left? We both knew that whatever we uncovered would not change the fact that we had found each other, but it would change the way we understood everything that led to this meeting, so we made a decision. We would dig together. The story of our birth had been split in two. It was time to gather the pieces. The first place we went together was the county records office. It sat in an older brick building downtown, the kind of place that still smelled faintly of toner and coffee and overheated copy machines. The hallways were lined with bulletin boards full of notices no one read, and every office door had that same metal plaque with black engraving. We explained that we were looking for birth and adoption records from the late 1960s. We presented our IDs. We answered questions. We tried to keep our voices calm. The clerk behind the desk, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, listened closely. When we mentioned the hospital name and the year, something flickered in his expression. Not recognition exactly, but wariness. He said records from that time were complicated. Adoption laws were different then, privacy practices were stricter, paperwork was sometimes sealed or misfiled or incomplete. He used the same word the hospital administrator had used: incomplete. Even so, he led us to a small research room and brought out a few large binders and microfiche reels. He showed us how to search by case number, by date, by court docket, and then he left us alone. We found my birth registration fairly quickly. It matched the certificate my mother had saved. 2 babies, 2 female infants, one line left as living, the other noted as non-viable. There was no follow-up documentation in the county file, no funeral record, no burial paperwork, nothing. Erin's adoption took longer to find. Her original birth certificate had been amended when she was adopted. The law at the time allowed the state to issue a new certificate listing her adoptive parents as if they were her biological ones. This practice had been common in closed adoptions and had effectively erased evidence of many children's origins. But buried in a thin, fragile file, we finally found an adoption order dated 6 weeks after we were born. The paperwork was sparse, but a few things stood out. The birth hospital was listed as St. Andrews. The mother was listed as unmarried. The father line was blank. The child's race, weight, and time of birth matched the details of twin B from my certificate. The medical section included a single phrase, infant stable and relinquished. None of it aligned with what my mother had written in her letters. She had been married when I was born. She had been present. She had never signed anything relinquishing a child. This suggested something more deliberate, something organized, something that had required people in different roles to repeat the same lie. The retired clerk I had spoken to earlier had hinted at that. She had mentioned money, she had mentioned religious pressure, she had mentioned that certain doctors had strong opinions about who deserved to raise children and under what conditions. Now those hints were solidifying into something uglier. We requested copies of everything, even the pages that looked routine. The clerk's eyes lingered on us a little too long when we turned in the request, as if he knew we had stumbled into a story that had been buried for a reason. We decided to visit the retired clerk in person. She lived in a small house on the edge of town, the kind with wind chimes on the porch and a metal mailbox that had been repainted more than once. Her yard was neat. A bird feeder hung from a low branch. It looked like the kind of house where nothing dramatic had ever happened, which is exactly what made it the perfect place for someone who had spent their working life surrounded by other people's hardest moments. She greeted us with a cautious warmth, the way people do when they have agreed to something before they fully understand what it will feel like. We sat in her living room. She studied our faces carefully. I could tell she saw the resemblance before we said a word. She told us that during her years working at the hospital, she had seen many things she still struggled with. She had watched women sign papers they did not fully understand. She had witnessed family members speak over young mothers, make decisions for them, insist on what was best. She had seen doctors let their personal beliefs guide medical decisions far beyond what was ethical. She remembered my parents, although not in detail. She remembered that my mother had been young and looked overwhelmed. She remembered that my father's parents had been very involved, especially his mother. She remembered hearing comments about money, about responsibility, about God not making mistakes when he closed certain doors. Most painfully, she remembered that the word non-viable had sometimes been used in records when a baby had in fact been transferred to a different ward. There were cases where infants were labeled that way in internal hospital notes, while simultaneously being prepared for adoption elsewhere. Not always, not often, but sometimes. She said that looking back, she believed some of those adoptions had been less than legal, that arrangements had been made quietly between desperate couples and certain physicians, that unmarried mothers, poor families, and those with strict religious pressure were particularly vulnerable. She could not prove any of it now. Too many years had passed, too many files had been destroyed, lost, or deliberately altered, but she remembered enough to look at us both with grief in her eyes. When we left her house, the winter air felt sharper. The sky seemed too bright. I had the strange sensation that the world should look different now, as if discovering something like this should alter colors and angles and light, but everything looked the same. Only I had changed. My father had died 15 years earlier. I could no longer ask him what he had known or what he had believed. His parents, my grandparents, were gone too. All of the people who had stood in that delivery room, paced that waiting area, or prayed in that chapel were beyond reach, but their traces remained. In my mother's letters, she wrote about my father's mother often. She wrote that my grandmother had a strict religious streak and a deep belief that God did not give people more than they could handle. She also wrote that my grandmother had considered poverty, youth, and instability as signs that someone was not meant to be a parent. My parents had been struggling when I was born. Money was tight. My father's work was inconsistent. They lived in a small rental. My grandmother had believed that even one baby would be hard for them. Two must have seemed impossible to her. My mother wrote about arguments in the hospital, raised voices in hallways, my grandmother insisting they could not take both babies home, my mother insisting she wanted them both. Somewhere between those arguments and the discharge documents, one baby had vanished. My mother wrote that after she was told one of the twins had died, my grandmother spoke to her in a firm, almost soothing tone. She said that God had made the decision for them, that this was a mercy, that now my parents could focus on raising one child well instead of two poorly. She told my mother to see it as a blessing in disguise, not a tragedy. Grief mixed with guilt, guilt mixed with fear, fear mixed with dependence. My mother had needed my grandmother's help. She had needed somewhere to stay. She had needed someone to watch me while she healed. When you depend on people who hurt you, it can become easier to absorb their explanations than to fight them. She wrote that for years. She tried to believe the story she had been told. She tried to accept that her baby had died, even though she had no grave to visit. Every time she questioned it aloud, my grandmother would remind her that she was being ungrateful, unfaithful, or dramatic. The retired clerk had described a grandmother like that, a woman whose certainty left no space for questions. It became clear that whatever had happened in that hospital room had not been an accident. It had been a decision, maybe not one recorded in official language, but a decision all the same. A doctor with strong beliefs about family, a grandmother convinced she was rescuing her son, a system that allowed both of them to override a mother's voice, and a baby taken from one life and placed into another. Over the next few months, Erin and I spent more time together. We traded weekends visiting each other's homes. We explored the differences in how we had been raised. Her adoptive parents had been older when they took her in. They had been steady, quiet people with stable jobs and a neat house. Their religion had been gentler, less controlling. They had told her early on that she was adopted, but they had framed it as a story of blessing and answered prayers. They said a young woman had not been able to keep her and that they had stepped in to give her a good life. They had not known about me. They had not known about our mother being told her baby had died. They had not known about my grandmother's pressure or the doctor's choices. They had been told only what they needed to hear to complete the adoption. They had done their best with the story they were given. Hearing about her life was both comforting and painful. I was glad she had been loved. I was glad she had not grown up in neglect or cruelty. But it hurt to know that the family she grew up in had been built on a lie my mother had to live with forever. There was no way to fix that now. We both had to accept that the past could not be rewritten, only understood. One afternoon, we sat at her kitchen table surrounded by papers, birth records, adoption orders, copies of my mother's letters, notes from the retired clerk. We had spread everything out like puzzle pieces, hoping that if we looked at them from enough angles, a complete picture would finally emerge. What we saw instead was a pattern people have repeated in different forms for generations: a young woman's voice discounted, a poor couple's choices overridden, a child's origins rewritten to make other adults more comfortable. No single document spelled it out clearly. No one had written, "We are taking this baby from this mother against her will." That is not how injustice usually records itself. Instead, it leaves faint fingerprints in words like non-viable and unmarried and relinquished. It hides behind phrases like best interest and better life. It relies on time to soften edges and blur specifics until all that remains is a vague sense that something happened and cannot be changed. But we had enough to know. My mother had given birth to 2 daughters. My grandmother had believed they could not handle 2. A doctor had agreed, and a system had quietly arranged for one baby to be handed to another family. The worst part was realizing that my mother had not imagined her doubts. She had sensed the truth even as everyone around her insisted otherwise. That knowledge became its own kind of grief. There are moments when I wish I could rewind time and press this ending into my mother's hands while she was still alive. I imagine sitting at her kitchen table with her, spreading out the documents, and telling her that she had been right all along, that she had not been hysterical or confused, that her baby had not died, that the world had lied to her, not the other way around. I imagine her meeting Aaron, seeing our faces side by side, hearing our similar laughs, watching us move through a room together like 2 people who had always been meant to share space. Sometimes I picture the 3 of us cooking in her small kitchen, bumping into each other with an ease that comes from familiarity. I imagine her standing back for a moment, drying her hands on a towel, just looking at us. There is a version of reality where that happened, just not this one. In this reality, my mother died with half her story unresolved. She died believing a baby had been taken from her, but never knowing for sure. She died surrounded by unsent letters and a birth certificate she could not bring herself to destroy. I have had to make peace with the fact that I cannot give her this closure. I can only live in a way that honors the truth she never stopped feeling. Erin has her own version of that grief. Her adoptive parents believed they had rescued a child. They never got to learn the full context either. They didn't know they were participating in a system that sometimes exploited women like my mother. They did not live long enough to hear the whole story. So now Erin and I carry all of it: the grief, the gratitude, the anger, the love. We have learned that it is possible to be grateful for the life you received and still angry about the way it was arranged. We can both love the families who raised us and mourn the family that was never allowed to exist. People sometimes ask whether I forgive the people who made those decisions in that hospital room. They think forgiveness is a simple on-off switch, something you either grant or withhold. It isn't. I do not know the exact conversation that took place between my grandmother and the doctor and whoever handled the paperwork. I don't know what fears they carried, what cultural beliefs shaped them, what pressures they faced. I don't know if they believed that what they were doing was truly right, or if they simply chose what was easiest for them and never looked back. What I do know is this: my mother's voice did not matter to them as much as their own. Her grief was treated as an inconvenience. Her bond with her child was treated as something negotiable. That is hard to forgive. And yet, choosing to stay permanently angry at people who are already dead feels like pouring acid onto my own life. It changes nothing about the past. It only eats away at my present. So instead of forgiveness in the neat, tidy sense, I have settled into something more complicated. A kind of acceptance that acknowledges harm without excusing it. A decision to let the truth stand without allowing it to define every part of who I am. I can't change what they did. I can only change what happens next. If I pulled this story tight into a neat arc, it might end with some dramatic moment: a courtroom, a confession, a long-lost file suddenly discovered in perfect condition that confirms everything in one sentence. Real life does not work that way. What we have instead is a series of small, steady decisions. Erin and I have chosen to be in each other's lives, not as curiosities or projects or living symbols of some social issue, but as sisters. Simple as that, and not simple at all. We text about ordinary things: work frustrations, weather complaints, new recipes that turned out better than expected. We call each other when something small and annoying happens, the way people do when they know someone else is carrying a similar internal map. Sometimes we still catch each other staring. She will glance at me and then look again, as if she has seen her own reflection surprising her from a new angle. I do the same. There is something endlessly strange about seeing your own face attached to someone else's history. We have visited the cemetery where my parents are buried. She stood with me at my mother's grave, her hands tucked into her coat pockets, her breath visible in the cold air. Neither of us spoke for a long time. At some point, I placed my hand on the headstone and told my mother in my mind that I had found her daughter. I told her that the baby she had cried for her whole life had grown into a woman who was kind and stubborn and thoughtful, a woman who lived less than an hour away, a woman who had wondered for years why she felt incomplete. I do not know what my mother would have said. I only know that I felt something loosen in my chest, like a knot finally given space to untangle. I have shared this story here for a reason. Not because I want pity, not because I want outrage directed at people who cannot hear it now, but because I have learned that secrets like this do not stay contained. They leak out into families in subtle ways, through tensions no one can explain, through grief that resurfaces in unexpected moments, through quiet obsessions with things like twins and hospitals and lost paperwork. If you grew up with gaps in your family story, you might know this feeling, the sense that something is missing, even if you cannot name it. The way certain topics were always avoided, the way adults changed the subject when you asked questions. Sometimes there is nothing there, sometimes a silence is just a silence. But sometimes it hides a truth that could change how you see yourself. I am not saying everyone should go looking for lost twins or hidden adoptions. Not every mystery can be safely solved. But I do believe this. If something inside you has been whispering for years that the story you were told is incomplete, you are not crazy. You are not ungrateful. You are not disloyal. You might simply be standing at the edge of a door that was slammed shut a long time ago. And if you choose to open it, even a little, you deserve to know that you are not alone. There are countless stories like mine. Some end in reunions, some end in more questions, some never end at all. But in every single one of them, someone, somewhere, decided that another person's truth was too inconvenient to be written down. I am trying to write ours down now. Sometimes at night, I think about the first weeks after we were born, the days I do not remember, but my body might. I imagine two bassinets in a hospital nursery, two tiny girls lying a few inches apart, maybe reaching for each other without knowing why, breathing the same air, hearing the same sounds, sharing the same beginning. Then I imagine hands lifting one of those babies and carrying her away, down a hallway, into another room, into another life. That moment shaped everything that came after: my mother's grief, my grandmother's certainty, my father's silence, my sister's adoption, my own understanding of who I was, and yet, here we are, two women in our mid-50s who found each other anyway. We were separated by lies and paperwork and distance. We were reunited by a piece of mail, a file in an attic, a clerk's memory, and a DNA test. Sometimes, late in the evening, I stand in front of the mirror again. I see my mother's face in mine. I see my grandmother's eyes. I see my own choices layering themselves over inherited features. And now, I see my sister too, not as a ghost hovering beside me, but as a real person whose number is in my phone, whose favorite coffee mug sits in my cabinet for when she visits, whose laugh I can hear in my head even when the house is quiet. I cannot change the beginning of our story, but I can refuse to let it stay buried. So this is what I can offer. To the twin I did not get to grow up with, I am glad you exist. I am glad you were loved. I am glad we found each other while there is still time to share the rest of our lives. To the mother who carried both of us and was told to forget, you were right to doubt. You were not crazy. Your grief had a shape for a reason, and to anyone listening who has ever felt like something in their family's story doesn't quite add up, you are not alone. If you've ever discovered a hidden document, an old photograph, a strange record, or a truth that made you see your life differently, I would like to hear it. Stories like this are heavy to carry alone. Thank you for sitting with mine, and for giving my mother's forgotten twin daughter, the sister I finally know by name, a place in your memory too.